We have different gifts, according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it is serving, then serve. If it is teaching, then teach. If it is to encourage, then give encouragement. If it is giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. Romans 12:6-8, King James Version, Chapter 1. Independence, Missouri, May, 1867. You ever driven a team of oxen afore? George Walton's father, Harry, asked the young man in front of him. There wasn't a chance the stranger got his hands dirty, when he could pay someone to do the hard work for him. No, sir. I was hoping to hire someone with experience to do that for me. George smirked. She knew it. He wouldn't last 2 minutes in Santa Fe with his stiff, formal clothes that perfectly matched his stuffy personality. George here will work for you. She turned, waiting for the inevitable response. From the back, she looked just like everyone else who worked the wagon trains. Her clothes were serviceable and of a nondescript color from too many washes in various rivers and streams. Not that endless cleaning ever quite got rid of the trail dust. From the front, however, no one would mistake her for a young man. But, he's a girl. George lifted one eyebrow contemptuously, while her father guffawed beside her, slapping his hat against his leg. That's right, I am a girl. So pleased you've noticed. Now we have that out of the way, let's talk about what you have, what you don't have, and what you will need in order to make the journey. The rich man with the smooth accent that screamed of wealth and privilege frowned at her. What we have, what we don't? George blew out a breath, making no effort to hide her frustration. Your equipment and provisions, everything you will need to make the trip. You don't provide a wagon. She closed her eyes and reached deep for patience. She'd taken greenhorns along the Santa Fe Trail before, but this man had to be the most naive, ridiculous fool she'd met in a long time. At the sound of his deep laugh, she snapped open her eyes. Very funny. I am not a complete novice. My mother and I got here from Boston without mishap. He stuck out a hand. I am Elijah Mitchell. George wiped her hand on her thigh before completing the handshake. His hand was as soft as she had expected, but firm, which was a shock. She'd expected something weak and half-hearted. She swallowed to hide her surprise. Pleased to meet ya. He turned and beckoned an older woman to his side. This is my mother, Grace Mitchell. George fought the urge to curtsy to the other woman. She was an absolute picture of elegance. Dark hair, threaded through with streaks of gray, was pinned into an elaborate style. Her clothes were neat and tidy, with not a speck of dust or dirt to be seen. Queen Victoria could not have made George any more nervous. Women like this plain intimidated her. Mama, Elijah was now saying, This is, Miss George. It is a real pleasure to meet you, ma'am. Mrs. Mitchell clasped George's proffered hand in both of hers. I am delighted to meet you, dear. George looked around the camp, hoping inspiration would strike and a refined topic of conversation would spring to her mind. However, as her life comprised riding reluctant oxen through creeks, hunting for wild game and other such pursuits, she couldn't think of a single topic she could confidently speak on. Georgiana, she said eventually, then felt heat rising in her cheeks. That is, my name is Georgianna Walton. Grace Mitchell nodded seriously, as though George had shared something incredibly important with her. Have you worked on wagon trains long? Ever since I can remember. George stared at Grace wistfully and wished she knew how to twist her hair into an elegant style. The only people she knew who wore their hair the same way she did were little girls and Indians. And you are to drive our wagon for us? Yes, ma'am. I expect we shall become very good friends along the way, Grace said, smiling kindly. My son is a doctor, so he will probably be too busy to keep company with me. It was true enough that if there was anyone with any level of doctoring skills on a wagon train, they were usually occupied with accidents, outbreaks of disease, and the odd childbirth along the way. George looked over at Eli. She supposed having such soft hands helped if he was a doctor. But then, what did she know? She was unschooled and knew only what her father had taught her and what she had picked up from people she had met on previous wagon trains. "Yes, ma'am." George nodded and repeated her earlier phrase. She had no idea what the correct response was to such a lady suggesting they be friends. "We leave in the morning, is that correct?" Eli asked. "I'll find my pa so you can settle things with him," George said. "First light, the bugle will sound, and we will leave, with or without you." "We will be here," he assured her. That knowledge gave George a funny sensation in her tummy, as though she was traveling downhill in the back of a wagon that was going too fast. Exciting at first, but followed quickly by a certainty the trip would end in disaster. It wasn't like her to have such fanciful thoughts. She moved off to find her father before being near the Mitchells caused her to have any other ridiculous notions. He was a rich doctor from Boston, and she was a woman who only knew how to relate to men who did the same work she did. She had no business noticing how his demeanor gave the impression of being steadfast and unflappable, both worthy qualities for the grueling trip ahead, or how his dark hair made his blue eyes seem so bright and clear. Funny how she had no idea what color his mother's eyes were. The next morning, before it was light, Elijah and his mother arrived at the campsite they had visited the previous afternoon to secure their passage to Santa Fe. Although trading still thrived in the town, more people were settling there with their families. An old friend worked as a doctor there and had suggested Eli join him as he could promise plenty of work. Eli was only too happy to get himself and his mother out of Boston and as far away as possible. "Are you certain you want to do this, Mama? There is still time for us to change our plans." Eli did not know what the journey would be like, but he had heard enough cautionary tales that made him wary of what lay ahead, particularly for his mother. "There is nothing for us in Boston and nothing for us here. You have a future in Santa Fe. I want nothing more than to be there with you. I believe you are coming because you are hoping for grandchildren." His mother laughed. Eli wished he had cause to hear that sound more often. Neither of them had much cause for merriment lately. "I would be a terrible grandmother if I were in Boston, and my grandbabies were on the other side of the country." "I intend to build my practice, Mother. There will be no babies any time soon, I'm afraid." "Very well, dear," Grace nodded. "I am quite content to wait a year or two." Eli smiled indulgently. His mother deserved all the good things in life, including being surrounded by a passel of adoring grandchildren. If only the burden for fulfilling that particular desire didn't fall so heavily on his shoulders. Though, for all they knew, his brother Isaac could have any number of children by now. However, he had not been seen for over 6 years, and despite the advertisements Eli had placed in several newspapers, Isaac had not returned home for their father's funeral. "Let us find our wagon," Eli suggested, "and we shall begin our new adventure." Grace nodded her agreement, but Eli could sense her reticence. It had worried her when they left Boston that if Isaac turned up, they would no longer be in their old home. He would have no way of finding them. Privately, Eli did not believe his brother was still alive. Surely he would not have allowed his parents to suffer years of worry over his well-being if he were still living. Some minutes later, they found their wagon, which Eli had painstakingly packed the previous afternoon. His mother wanted her sewing to be easily accessible, and he required his medical equipment to be handy, should the need arise. They had brought with them very few items from their old home. They had sold most of the furniture to settle his father's debts and to pay their way to Santa Fe. "Mornin'," George inclined her head at Eli. "Ma'am." She looked almost shy when addressing his mother, as though she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. Her glossy black hair was pulled into 2 braids which hung down her back. An enormous hat sat on top of her head. Eli had met no one quite like George in his life. "How are you this morning?" he asked. "Ready to get on the trail," George said, glancing his way. "The sitting around waiting to set off is always the worst part. I'm happier when I'm busy." "Don't you tire of following the same route backwards and forwards?" "No 2 journeys are ever the same," she told him. "There's always something new to see, something different to experience. Yet there was something in the tone of her voice that told him there was something she was hiding. The bugle sounded before he could say any more. An excited chatter rose around them. 2 young men approached him and introduced themselves. Joshua and Noah Prescott. Looks like we'll be traveling alongside you. Pleased to meet you. I'm Eli Mitchell. This is my mother, Mrs. Grace Mitchell, and Miss George is riding our wagon. George wrinkled her nose at the introduction, but said nothing. She gave both newcomers a polite nod. The younger of the 2 men, Noah, peered at George curiously before seeming satisfied she was in fact a girl. Nodded and turned back to Eli. Why are you traveling out west? I'm a doctor, Eli said. I have a job offer in Santa Fe. What about you fellows? Noah shrugged. Adventure, I guess? We can turn our hand to most things. We don't necessarily intend to travel all the way to Santa Fe. Things are changing in this country of ours, and we're looking to experience as much as we can. Josh looked over at Grace before turning back to Eli. Say, I don't suppose your mama would let us eat with you if we could put meat in the pot? Eli grinned. Thought you said you could turn your hand to most things. Ain't no man that likes cooking, Noah said with feeling. There aren't too many women who like washing and mending clothes, Grace said, giving both young men an appraising look. The younger man blushed. I meant no disrespect, ma'am. None taken. Grace looked toward the wagons that had already started out, then back to Eli. Can we strike a bargain with these young men, Mama? Eli asked brightly, aware of the apprehension in his mother's gaze. You will cook for our little group, and God willing, these fellows will be able to provide something nutritious for you to cook. If things get desperate, we can always slaughter a chicken, Noah said. Then looked at Grace. I would fully prepare it to be cooked, ma'am. A chicken? Grace's expression looked as confused as Eli felt. Didn't we mention, Josh chimed in, we have a basket full of chickens in our wagon. We like an egg in a morning, Noah added. Did you hear that, Eli? Grace smiled and looked genuinely thrilled at the news. We are to have freshly laid eggs on the trail. We are truly blessed to have met you both, thank you. Both young men awkwardly shuffled their feet in the dirt and looked between Eli and Grace with embarrassed little smiles. Eventually, they said one of them best get ready to drive their oxen, as it would surely be nearly time for them to move out. As they passed George, Noah called out, Ready for the off, Miss George? I was born ready, she answered flippantly, without looking their way. Then she leaned out of her seat so she was closer to them and added, She kind of makes you feel as though you should bow to her, doesn't she? She's a grand lady, that's certain. She reminds me of our mama, Noah said wistfully. Josh bumped into his brother. She's nothing like our mama, and you are too young to remember what she was like. All right then, Noah retorted. She is exactly the sort of ma I would like to have had. Eli, who had moved forward with the young men to speak to George before they left, smiled proudly. His mother was an exceptional woman, and he knew how very lucky he was to have her sweet, supportive influence in his life. He noticed George's pained expression. She had not offered an anecdote about her own mother to the conversation, though surely, if she had a mother to influence her, she wouldn't be traveling the Santa Fe Trail driving a team of oxen for a complete stranger. Not for the first time since he had met her the previous day, Eli wondered if she traveled the Santa Fe Trail through choice or because it was her only option. Eli knew how it felt to be out of options. The job offer from his old friend had come at a time when he didn't have any of his own. All set? He asked, injecting as much friendliness into his tone as he could. Yes, sir. George didn't look around at him and sounded about as remote as was possible for a person sitting a few feet away. She hadn't seemed reluctant to speak to Noah only a few moments earlier. Eli couldn't fathom why that bothered him. He had no time to ponder it further because a shout went up from the Prescott boys in the wagon in front of theirs. They were moving. George spent the morning calming her frustration. It wasn't Eli's fault he had been born into a family with obvious privilege. Neither was it the Prescott boys' fault they were traveling simply for an adventure. They didn't have to go anywhere. She, on the other hand, didn't have anywhere she could stay. It had always been just her and Harry on the trails together, as far back as she could remember. When she felt this way, Harry always told her she wouldn't know what to do with a permanent home because she had never had one, but George thought it was something she would really like to try. As soon as they stopped for their noon meal, she grabbed the biggest pot Grace had in their wagon and set off to the nearby creek to fill it, while the men took care of the animals. Kneeling by the pitiful water supply, she quickly washed the dust from her face and hands before holding the receptacle in the water to fill it. Grace had walked next to Eli alongside their wagon that entire morning and still looked as neat and tidy when they stopped as she had when they left Independence. In contrast, George didn't need a looking glass to know wisps of hair had come loose from her braids and stood out wildly around her face. She looked down at her serviceable clothes in disgust. No doubt Harry would tell her she wouldn't know what to do with a pretty dress. And goodness knew she didn't frequent the sort of places where she would need one. But it didn't stop her from wanting one, even if it was just for one day. "Miss George!" George turned, attempting to put a smile on her face. It wasn't his fault she was jealous of the opportunities life had given him. She would also do well to remember that he was employing her. There hadn't really been any excuse for her rudeness earlier. "Doc." She wasn't sure where that had come from. She didn't feel comfortable calling him simply Eli in the same way she had heard his mother refer to him. Dr. Mitchell didn't feel right, and Mr. Mitchell was entirely too formal. She hoped Doc would strike an acceptable level of politeness. Eli put one knee on the ground next to her and reached over, grasping the full pan of water in both hands. "I'll take this for you." George did not loosen her hold. "I've got it." "Well, sure," Eli said with a slight smile. "I can see that, but it's heavy. I would be glad to take it for you." "You don't need to," George insisted stubbornly. "I know I don't need to." Eli brushed back a lock of hair that had fallen onto his forehead. "But I would like to help you. You are already doing so much for my family." She couldn't really continue to argue over carrying water back to their camp without looking churlish. "I'm not doing much, just driving your wagon." Eli hefted the container from the creek bottom. "It is a lot to me. I appreciate your help. As I told your father, I don't know the first thing about this kind of thing." "This kind of thing," George echoed as they began the short walk back to Grace. "Living off the land or on rationed provisions, let alone how to look after animals. I don't know the first thing about caring for them, or even harnessing them up to the wagon." "What about your mama?" George inquired. "Does she know about any of these things?" Eli looked directly at George, and his mouth quirked a little, as though he was about to admit something that embarrassed him. "I am sure that you've already guessed that we had people that did these things for us back in Boston." "You have very smooth hands," George said, then cursed her impulsive words. This was yet another reason she would never be a proper lady. She never had learned how to think before she spoke. "They are not the hands of a man who does manual labor." "You're right, they're not." He smiled earnestly at her then. And despite herself, her heart flailed in her chest like a fish out of water. "But I mean to learn." "You want to learn how to drive the team?" "Very much," Eli confirmed. "Josh and Noah have agreed to teach me how to care for the animals." If only it were that easy for her to learn how to be the sort of girl a man would want to look at in the way she had seen some travelers look at their wives. Of course, she knew the simple stuff. For starters, it would probably help some if she stopped dressing like a man. "I would be happy to teach you." "When can we start?" he asked in a voice so earnest and excited. George couldn't help but wonder what his life had been like before that moment. Eli had clearly come from a privileged background, so George couldn't understand why learning how to get slow, docile oxen to pull a wagon would make him so happy. "I guess after we've eaten." George was a little afraid she was now talking herself out of a job. What if once he realized how very easy it was, he didn't need her to do it anymore and didn't want to pay her? "Of course, I won't be able to do it every day," he said, as though reading her mind. "I expect to be kept busy on the journeys taking care of those accompanying us on the trail." He was right there. Although they had only been traveling for half a day, it wasn't unusual for someone to have fallen sick in that short time, or been unwell before they set off but hidden it because they didn't want to be left behind. George had seen so much misery in her years on the trail. Children falling out of wagons into fast-moving streams as their family were trying to cross, pregnant women forced to labor in the back of a cramped wagon, and disease which wiped out entire families. It was more unusual for there to be a trained professional that could be relied upon. There was no doubt Eli would be very well occupied. "Perhaps we could start today." George nodded. There wasn't a polite way she could suggest he let one of the Prescott boys help him. Not that she didn't want to give help, but more like she wasn't quite sure what her insides would do when he was sitting on the buckboard next to her. When he had leaned close to her back at the stream, her heart had reacted in a most peculiar fashion. If he was right next to her for an entire afternoon, George wasn't sure she could hide the tremble in her hands. It really was most frustrating that this man, out of all the ones in the entire world, had to be the one that made her heart hammer in her chest. Her hands feel clammy, and her tongue seemed too thick to form clear sentences. Chapter 2. After their noon meal, Eli stood next to the front of the wagon. Chivalry suggested he should help George up onto the seat. But she was so self-reliant, he was afraid she would be insulted by his offer of help. He shuffled his feet awkwardly and eventually decided doing the right thing was more important than being rebuffed by the woman who had absolutely captured his attention. Eli had never met a woman like her before. "Please let me help you." He held out a hand, then changed his mind. Eli placed his hands at her waist and lifted her onto the seat. "I've been doing that by myself since I was 3, George snapped, and turned away from him. But not before he could see heat had risen in her cheeks. Eli grinned to himself as he moved around the back of the wagon to the other side. That had gone slightly better than he thought. She hadn't slapped his hands away, and neither had she told him never to do such a thing ever again. He would take that as a victory, never mind how small. George waited for the Prescott wagon in front to move off before she flicked the reins and shouted aloud, "Gee up!" "Does it have to be gee up?" Eli asked. "I suppose you'd rather tell the oxen to please get along now?" She looked at him and raised an eyebrow sarcastically. Eli grinned back, rather liking her gentle teasing. "Perhaps I'll try gee up, please, when it's my turn to take the reins." He stared straight ahead, but could see her turn to him out of his peripheral vision, her mouth slightly agape as she shook her head. Eli couldn't help himself. He burst into noisy laughter. "Miss George!" "You're foolin' with me," she said flatly. "Lighten up, Miss George," Eli returned mildly. "You can't dish it out and not be able to take it back. I can never tell when you're laughing at me." Eli immediately turned serious. "I would never do that. Why ever would you think that?" "Plenty have." She shrugged one shoulder to appear she wasn't at all bothered. But that one slight gesture showed Eli how very desolate and alone she seemed. "I'm truly sorry if others have made you feel that way, Miss George." He put out a hand to lay it on her arm, but pulled it back. "I never intended to hurt your feelings." "My feelings are not hurt." It was not the right time to press the subject. Eli had never met such a prickly woman. She didn't want him to help carry water, she didn't like it if she teased him, and she snapped at him for no reason whatsoever. Yet he liked her. He admired her courage in following her father along the trail, even if, like she said, it was her only option. It still took a lot of strength and determination. "What happens when they are moving along like this?" "Nothin'. You just hold the reins." "When we are moving along like this is the straightforward part. It's if they try to move off course, or when we are trying to cross a stream, that the real hard work starts, or if something spooks them. Josh and Noah spoke to me about not making loud noises near them. They get frightened and start running. That's when people get hurt." "Have you seen that happen?" George slid a glance his way, her eyes wide and full of sadness. "I know enough to know that's when you'll be needed." "You have seen a good many things that must have been very difficult to bear," he said gently. "Mostly it's folks' own stupidity," she barked out. Eli frowned. She didn't seem like a cruel person, but her words were not kind. "Explain what you mean." "I'm sure you think I'm very brash." George didn't look at him, but her mouth twisted before she continued. but when you see people die needlessly, it angers me." "Is that what happened to your mother?" His words were out before he could stop them. He held his breath, waiting to see if she would answer his impertinent question or rebuke him for being so personal. "My mother died in childbirth. No one's at fault." The words were said quickly, as if she didn't want them in her mouth, but needed to set them free. The 3 words she slapped on the end were clearly what she had been told, but did not believe. "I'm so very sorry, George." This time, Eli didn't stop himself, reaching out with one hand and laying it on her arm. She flinched slightly, but didn't pull away from his touch. "That's why I get so mad when people do foolish things." "I can certainly understand that," Eli said with feeling. He still had to make sense of his father's betrayal. Sometimes it's very hard to see God's plan in something so very senseless. George sucked in an angry breath. "I will never understand why people like you say such things. If there is a God, why would he allow my ma to die?" "You don't believe there is a God?" "I told ya, I don't see how a God would leave a baby motherless." Eli wished he had a wise answer for her, but he did not. "I often think the same when I'm working. But it's not for me to comprehend God's plan." "That's a very unsatisfactory answer." "I agree," Eli said quietly, "but it is the only answer I have. If I still had a mother, I would not be sitting here doing this." George motioned to the oxen in front of them. Emotion colored every one of her words. "Where do you think you would be?" "How should I know?" she answered crossly. "Tell me, Miss George." Eli lowered his voice. "Where would you like to be, if you could choose?" "I would be in a little house of my own. I would never travel the Santa Fe Trail ever again. In fact, I would go nowhere ever again." Eli was processing her words when Noah came running towards them. "There's rabbit everywhere. I've got 3 for tonight's supper." "Bet he has no idea how to skin them or make a stew out of them," George muttered. "Good work," Eli called out. It was hard not to find the younger man's enthusiasm for everything infectious. That is, he himself found it difficult. George, however, did not seem the least bit impressed. What on earth had made her spill her innermost thoughts so very easily? George had told no one before that her greatest dream was to have a home and never travel a rotten trail again as long as she lived. It was also most unlike her to be surly and over-emotional. She was acting like a teenage boy who'd had his freedom curtailed. Hers was the very opposite problem. She had all the freedom she liked. She just didn't want it anymore. As soon as they stopped for the night, she had taken the rabbits Noah had shot and prepared them for the pot. It had occurred to her as the afternoon wore on that the chances Grace knew how to cook were very slim. It was all right Josh and Noah asking to share their campfire and meals, but they probably knew more about putting together a meal than the older woman did. George looked up from her work, and off in the distance, she could see the Prescott brothers with their heads next to Eli's. She had to give him his due. He was keen to learn. In her experience, most men with his background were only too keen to let others do the hard, dirty work while they sat back watching. It shouldn't concern her that Eli wasn't like that. It shouldn't matter to her at all. Yet she couldn't help being pleased that he had more integrity and the drive to learn how to survive in the hostile environment than to sit back and let others work while he was idle. "Georgianna, dear," Grace whispered from behind her. George jumped. She had been so busy extolling Eli's virtues to herself that she hadn't heard his mother approach. "Yes, Mrs. Mitchell." "Oh, please, call me Grace." She waved a dismissive hand. "It seems silly to observe propriety while we are all practically living with each other." That thought made George feel uncomfortable, because all she could now imagine was the little house she had long dreamed of with Eli and Grace standing outside of it. It was all well and good having harmless daydreams, but she had no business adding real-life people into them. "What can I do for you?" George smiled awkwardly at the other woman. "Grace? I promised those nice young men I would cook for them, but—" Grace lowered her gaze, and her cheeks pinked. George watched her in fascination. She never would have imagined that a woman who seemed so self-assured and in complete control of her life would blush, especially in front of her. You don't know how, George guessed. I don't have the first clue, Grace confessed with a nervous laugh. Mr. Doctor. Eli, Grace said with a low chuckle. Just call him Eli. If he hasn't given you permission to use his first name, well, I give you it here and now. I gave it to him after all. Eli, George repeated, liking a little too much how his name sounded on her lips. Shared a little about your life back in Boston, so I surmised maybe you had had little cooking practice. None, actually, Grace looked abashed once more. I could help you, George offered. I would be ever so grateful, Grace said. Maybe. George started, then stopped, feeling silly. Grace smiled encouragingly. Whatever it is, you can ask me. As I said yesterday, I would like us to be friends. We are going to be traveling a very long way together. It would be much less lonely for me if I had a friend to converse with. George could hardly believe that a woman such as Grace would want to be friends with a rough, uneducated, socially inept person such as her. I wanted to ask if you would show me how to do my hair. You have beautiful hair, it would be my pleasure. George held up the end of one of her braids. This is all I know how to do. Then I think there is another bargain we can make. Grace clapped her hands in delight. You can teach me how to cook. I shall teach you how to dress your hair. And maybe you would let me do something else for you? George frowned. She didn't want to take advantage of Grace. After all, showing her how to throw together a rabbit stew wasn't exactly difficult. Not when they still had fresh vegetables left in their provisions. What is it? Would you allow me to alter some of my old gowns for you? Oh, I couldn't let you do that. I would like to, Grace repeated. I believe I can alter some of my dresses with more voluminous material, so you would step into it like a pair of trousers. But from the outside, it looks like a dress. You can do that? George couldn't help the doubtful note in her voice. Of course I can, Grace laughed. As a proper East Coast lady, I wasn't taught to do much, apart from needlework. Needlework and making clothes are very different, ma'am. Grace, she reminded George gently. And you're quite right. However, I made my children's clothes when they were little boys. Not because I had to, but because it gave me pleasure to see my babies in clothes I had made with my own hands. Children? George saw Grace's face change as she spoke, and wished she hadn't voiced her question. Eli has an older brother, Isaac. George breathed a sigh of relief as Grace said the word has. That meant he was alive, and her thoughtless question wouldn't cause the other woman any upset. Yet even to George's untrained eye, Grace looked sad. He didn't want to come west with you. We didn't ask him. Grace looked at a spot on the horizon over George's shoulder. I am afraid we don't know where he is. Eli tried frantically to find his brother before we left Boston, but the trail was cold. It has been so many years since we've seen him, and we left it too late to try and find him. I'm so sorry, George said, echoing the words Eli spoke to her earlier that day. That must be very difficult for you. I console myself that at least I have a son who puts my happiness before his own. Grace smiled through her pain. But there is not a single thing I want more in the world than to have both of my boys together again. George was silent for a moment, contemplating Grace's words. Although Grace had lived a very different life to George's own, they were not that different. They both had dreams and desires, and were not entirely content with the lives they had. How do you do that? She asked. Do what? Grace asked, confused. Be so accepting of what you have and do not have? I don't accept it, dear, Grace told her. But I have learned to hand it over to someone greater than I am and be happy for the wonderful things in my life. She was talking about God, just as Eli had spoken about him earlier that day. I don't think I can do that. How do you know if you don't try? Grace asked tenderly. How do I try? George replied, uncertainty ringing in her words. Would you allow me to pray with you? George wasn't at all sure she wanted to start that kind of nonsense, but she wasn't about to say no to a lady who had promised to make her pants that looked like a dress and how to style her hair so she didn't look like a child. Okay. I hear the reluctance in your voice, Grace said, not unkindly. She caught hold of both of George's hands in her own. Close your eyes. George nodded, then realized Grace couldn't see her. They're closed. Our dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the friends you have blessed us with on our journey west. I thank you especially for sending Georgianna into our lives when we needed someone to help us. Please take care of my son, Isaac, and continue to keep him safe. In the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, Amen. George's heart squeezed painfully each time Grace called her by her full name. It felt as though the other woman could actually see her for who she really was, instead of who she had allowed herself to become. So I thank him for what I have and ask him to take care of what I don't have. Exactly that. Grace beamed at her. You are a quick student. George wanted to feel something. She wished that a warm feeling spread itself throughout her belly, or that she felt comforted by an all-encompassing love. Disappointment was the only emotion that flooded her. She had expected to feel different immediately. We should start the stew before the men take to eating their boots. Of course, dear. To her surprise, Grace didn't look at all upset that George had so abruptly changed the subject. She smiled at her just as serenely as she had earlier. George wished she had the sort of belief that would give her the same peace that Grace exuded. The days passed, blurring into one as the monotony of the trail got to Eli. He was luckier than the others because he could leave the wagon to tend to someone who had fallen sick or injured themselves. They were a little way south of Council Grove, and almost 2 weeks into their trek, when a shout came from ahead and the train slowly came to a halt. Can you see what is happening? George asked from her position next to the wagon. Eli was leading the team that day. Not a thing, he responded. Maybe we should swap places, and I'll go see what is going on. Eli quickly jumped down from the wagon. His mother had already grabbed his medical bag and passed it to him, a somber look on her face. He wasn't sure why, but he felt the same way. Something was desperately wrong. He hurried up the line, getting to the front before he saw the cause of the disturbance. A wheel on the lead wagon had broken, pitching the conveyance forward on the right side. He's stuck. He can't get out. What's happened? Eli gently pushed his way through the gathered onlookers. Harry, one man replied, his face ashen. He pitched forward when the wheel broke. Now he's stuck on the floor. Stuck? Between two of the oxen, someone else said. He's in a lot of pain. Eli called out, Harry, can you hear me? Yup, Harry responded. The single word short but full of hurt. We're going to get you free, but it might take a few minutes. You hang in there. Keep talking to me. Yup. Pa. Eli turned in time to see George shove her way through, so she was standing next to him. Talk to him, George. I want to know how he is doing while we get him out. Pa, it's me, George. I'm here now. You're going to be just fine. Stop fussin', girl. George smiled tremulously at Eli. He seems perfectly fine. Eli, who had already got to his knees to see where Harry was laying, had seen a pool of blood next to the older man. That told him that Harry was a long way from fine. He would not tell George that. Not when he was relying on her to keep her father calm and talking. Okay, Eli said, authority ringing in his words. First, we need to raise the wagon up and release the oxen from the yoke, but slow and steady, one at a time. He said a silent prayer and hoped this was the right way to release Harry. The last thing they needed was for the oxen to stomp around while the trail boss was in such a precarious position. Men hurriedly positioned themselves at the right side of the wagon next to the gap where the wheel should be. Others stood ready to release the oxen furthest away from Harry. On Eli's command, the wagon was righted, and they freed the first pair of oxen. Eli checked again on Harry's position. Harry! Yeah! Get him out, George cried out in anguish. We're trying, Eli assured her, but we dare not go too quickly in case the oxen step on him. Eli gave the command for the next set of oxen to be freed, to make sure the last two animals moved off to the sides and not backwards. He asked more men to stand in between the two beasts. As soon as the oxen were out of the way, the men on the wagon pulled it backwards out of the way so Eli could get to Harry. The reason for Harry's distress was immediately obvious. One of his legs was bent at an awkward angle and was bleeding heavily. Harry, Eli lightly tapped the injured man's cheeks. Harry's eyes flickered open. George, my girl? I'm here, Pa. George knelt next to her father. Sing. Did he say sing? Eli asked. He wants me to sing, George said. Eli nodded, but didn't understand the exchange between the Waltons. Now, Harry, I'm going to have to splint your leg. You may also need stitches. I have laudanum in my bag. I will give you that before I examine you. Sing, Harry repeated. George sang as her father had requested. For one moment, Eli forgot what it was he was supposed to be doing. He wasn't sure what he had expected when Harry asked his daughter to sing, but it hadn't been the beautiful, pure voice that filled the afternoon air. Eli pulled his bag closer and extracted the laudanum. Carefully, he measured some liquid onto a spoon and raised Harry's head so he could drink it. Then he took hold of a pair of scissors and cut away Harry's trousers so he could visualize the wound. The only sign that George had seen the devastating injury to Harry's left leg was a slight tremor in her voice. To her credit, however, she did not stop singing. Can you hold this against the wound? Eli asked, passing George a large dressing. He looked behind him. I'm going to need a plank of wood and string so I can splint this leg. A couple of the men nodded and hurried off. One older man peered over Eli's shoulder. Ain't no way he's keeping that leg. I think I can save it, Eli said defensively, wishing the other man would go away. The last thing he needed his patient hearing was that he was in danger of losing a leg. He can't travel like that. The man jerked a thumb towards Harry's injured leg. Eli had already thought about that. And it was true. Traveling in the back of a wagon with a splint on an unstable leg fracture was not advisable. It would be hard enough keeping infection at bay in a static environment. Herb, George stopped singing and addressed the other man. You can't possibly mean to leave my father. Herb looked around and shrugged. It's a nice enough place to camp. Maybe when the next wagon train comes along, he'll be well enough to move then. We're in the middle of the prairie, George yelled. You can't just leave us here. Now, George, you know I don't want to do this, but we can't stop the entire train for one injured man. You know that. You're a day and a half from Council Grove. That's hardly the middle of nowhere. Same thing, George said, biting her lip. Eli had worked out immediately Harry could not travel, but he hadn't stopped to think what that would mean for him until that moment. I will stay with him. You've got a job to go to, George said. I can't let you do that. Am I to leave you here alone to nurse your father? George's eyes were wide with panic. You can't stay, can you? She asked doubtfully, yet there was a note of pleading in her voice. Eli felt a hand rest on his shoulder. Even if my son were not a doctor, he would not leave your father, Georgianna. George shook her head at Grace's words. Why? Above all else, he is a man of honor. Grace shot a scathing look toward Herb. Men such as that simply do not abandon injured men and their family on the prairie to fend for themselves. That settles it, Herb said, throwing a look towards Harry. Hope you mend real quick. That's it, George said incredulously. Soon as they move your paw out of the way, we move on. Chapter 3. I still cannot believe he left, George said, staring at the dust that was just settling after the last wagon had pulled away. I've known that man my entire life. We should probably walk to the creek and wash up. Eli looked at George's clothes and then down at his own. Your father will sleep for a while yet. Is he going to be okay, Eli? George looked down at the ground. Staring into his sympathetic face would only start her crying again, and she'd done enough of that for one day. Tell me the truth. I would never lie to you, Miss George, Eli said earnestly. Your father is extremely unwell. As you know, the bone came right through the skin. That increases the chances of infection. I've done all that I can for now. George nodded, hearing Eli's words, but finding it hard to accept that they referred to her father. He had never had a day's sickness so far as she was aware. He was also going to be mighty angry when he woke to find the wagon train had moved on, and they were stuck a day and a half from civilization. Eli led the way down to the creek, leaving Grace sitting with Harry. Noah and Josh had stayed behind with them and quickly erected a tent, so Eli had somewhere safe and warm to tend to Harry. George smiled as she remembered Noah's enthusiasm at staying. Wouldn't dream of leaving our new friends. It's going to be an adventure out here on the prairie for sure. Josh had been quieter but just as steadfast in both his friendship and decision to stay. The water supply was close, and they soon had their hands washed clean. "It's not the worst place to be stranded," Eli said, a hopeful note in his voice. George realized he wanted her approval of the place that was going to be their home for the foreseeable future. "It's good country, a decent water source, some trees. It's just a bit open." Eli frowned. "What do you mean open?" "There's just us here against the elements. If something goes wrong, we're a long way from help. Help was right there for your father today, but we're still here more or less by ourselves." George rubbed her hands down her thighs. At least it would look as though she were drying her hands after washing them, and not because she was nervous. She couldn't help it. Every time she had a conversation with Eli that lasted more than a couple of sentences, her palms got sweaty and she could feel the heat climbing in her cheeks. "I would like to thank you for what you did today," she said awkwardly. "Few men would have left the others to help an old man you barely know." "My mother is right," Eli said. "I would have done it for a stranger. Haven't you heard of the parable of the Good Samaritan?" George answered warily. "Is this another God thing?" "Bear with me," Eli smiled. "The story starts with a traveler injured on a dangerous trail." "Sounds familiar." "Indeed," Eli nodded. "Only robbers beat the traveler and left him to die. Several people passed by and left him. One was a priest, the other a lawyer." "And they left him? Why would anyone do that?" George felt her anger bubbling to the surface again. "Just like Herb did, only he was Pa's friend." "Eventually another man came along," Eli continued the story. "Now this man was a Samaritan, who the traveler believed to be his enemy." "Why?" "Well, historically, the areas of Samaria and Judea were adversaries." George leaned closer to Eli, wanting to hear what happened next. "So the traveler feared the Samaritan?" Eli nodded. "I think he probably did. However, the Samaritan not only helped the traveler, but took him to an inn and paid them to look after the injured man. He also said if the cost was any more than the money he'd paid, he would pay anything outstanding the next time he passed through." "And that is why your mother said you would help. You're a doctor, so you've sworn an oath, but also you would choose to do the right thing." "God sees us all as equals. None of us are more special to him than another. Jesus taught that, although traditionally enemies, the Good Samaritan was a better neighbor to the traveler than the other two." George contemplated this for a moment. Even though most people would think they were better men. "Exactly." Eli smiled at her as though he was incredibly pleased with her answer. It made her remember her nerves, which she had momentarily forgotten while they spoke. Her stomach flip-flopped, and she sucked in a deep breath. "Maybe there's more to this God stuff than I thought." "Some of it is very interesting," Eli agreed. "Though there are parts of the Bible that are tough to read. There's a lot of history in there, but there are also a lot of stories that we can apply to our lives even these days, so many hundreds of years after the Bible was written." George laughed. "You should have been a preacher." "My mother would be very pleased to hear that." Eli grinned. "She would have liked that, but I chose to be a doctor like my father." "Eli," George said cautiously, "what happened to your father?" "He died," Eli answered with no emotion, his face closed down, letting her know he wouldn't answer any more questions about that particular subject. She almost wished she hadn't asked. However, he had asked her things about her family, and even though the subject had been hard to talk about, she had told him about her mother. "I should go back and check on your father," Eli said. "Your shirt is stained," George said. Then wished she could have ripped out her tongue. What a silly thing to say. She had been doing all right then, talking to him about his Bible story without embarrassing herself. Now, when she thought he was going to leave, she said something, anything, to make him stay a little longer. "Mother will try to clean it." Eli pointed towards George's own clothes. "Your trousers are ruined." George looked down at the dark stains marking the knees of her trousers. She couldn't imagine any amount of scrubbing would get the blood out. However, it would give her something to do instead of babbling to Eli. "I'll get the soap from our wagon and try anyway. If you give me your shirt, I'd be happy to clean yours too." George swallowed at the idea of handling a piece of Eli's clothing. It seemed too intimate somehow. You know, like a good neighbor should. Eli stared at her for a long moment, and George wondered if she'd said something wrong as she replayed her words through her head. "Our wagon is gone. I didn't even think to tell Herb he needed to leave your wagon." Eli took a step towards George, and for a moment, she thought he may try to comfort her, but his arms remained by his side. "Pa and I didn't really have a wagon of our own," she explained in a dull voice. "Our clothes and provisions were in a wagon we shared with Herb and another man. The other wagon was full of goods we were to trade in Santa Fe. So Herb has basically driven off with everything that you and your father own." George couldn't help it. She tried. But she couldn't stop the tears from falling down her cheeks once more. Today had been such a hard day. She wasn't a woman prone to emotional outbursts, but she thought perhaps the situation warranted it. "Yes," she confirmed. "Everything is gone." Eli closed the space between them and pulled her into his arms. "Miss George, I'm so sorry." He held her close while she sobbed, patting her back and muttering words of comfort that he was certain she wouldn't hear over the sounds of her distress. Eventually, she pulled away and scrubbed a hand over her face. "My ma's things were in that wagon." Now he understood what she was so completely devastated. "Perhaps you will get them back." "Please don't tell me to say a prayer for them," George retorted. "You saw how easily Herb left my pa. He won't think twice about selling our things in Santa Fe. Surely he must know how valuable those items are to you." "He does, but I'm not sure that he cares." Eli could try to reassure her by saying perhaps Herb only seemed cold and heartless because he had goods to sell and people who were now relying solely on him to get them safely to Santa Fe. However, he didn't think George would want to hear his platitudes right then. "I think I might understand a little of how you feel." "How could you possibly?" George snapped. "Your mother is still alive. You have had years of loving her and experiencing her loving you." "My father is dead," Eli said. "I apologize. It was a thoughtless thing to say." George looked sulky now, the fire gone out of her. "I have only a shawl that belonged to my ma, and some clothes she made when she was expecting me. Those are truly more precious items than the things we left behind," Eli acknowledged. "You've never said," George looked at him now, with questions both in her eyes and on her lips. "Why did you leave Boston exactly?" Eli looked away. "I told you, I have a job offer in Santa Fe." "You didn't work in Boston." "Of course I did." Eli wished they had never started this conversation. He didn't wish to be untruthful, but neither did he wish to tell George the whole nasty truth. "You couldn't have carried on working there and stayed in your fine house." Eli shook his head. "No." He could see the wheels turning in George's brain as she processed what he had told her and what he had left out. "Only reasons I can think for you leaving somewhere you've lived all your life, and the place your brother knows where to find you, is because of money or scandal." Her words poked at the hole in his heart. Part of the reason for moving away from Boston was so he and his mother need never speak of what had happened ever again. Eli certainly did not want to be talking about it in the middle of the Kansas prairie. He injected false optimism into his voice. "I'm sure Isaac will locate us if he tries hard enough." George assessed him, then slowly nodded her head. "And I don't suppose you're going to tell me why Isaac left either." Eli had never believed it would be easier to deal with an emotional woman than one that asked endless questions about things he didn't want to talk about. Right then, he would be happy to talk about any emotion she had, so long as they stayed away from his own. He fell back on the first excuse he could think of. "It wouldn't be fair on my mother." George nodded, as though his words made perfect sense. "She wouldn't want you discussing your private family business with someone like me." It wasn't the first time he had heard George putting herself down, as though she believed she was not as important as others. With anyone. "It's all right." Her braids bounced as she shrugged. "Just because I've spilled my guts doesn't mean you should." "I guess when it comes to family, I'm a private person," Eli said gently. She stared right at him, and he could see that although she claimed to have told him her secrets, there were still things she was not saying. Not that she should. They were her business. The same way his reasons for leaving Boston were his. "We should get back," George said. "They will wonder where we have been, and I would hate for tonight's stew to burn while your mother is watching over my paw." Eli didn't want to go back before he had made things right with George, but he didn't know what to say. Exactly like when he was planning to leave for Boston, and he couldn't say the right things to persuade his fiancée to travel west with him. "Mama," Eli exclaimed, "this stew is delicious." George smiled at Grace and nodded her head slightly in acknowledgement of the other woman's first attempt to cook by herself. "Can't remember when I've tasted a meal so good," Noah said between mouthfuls. "It's very good," Josh nodded. "Thank you, everyone," Grace said, sitting with her legs out in front of her and her ankles crossed primly. The Prescotts were sitting cross-legged, though Eli sat in the same way as his mother. George looked down at her own crossed legs. Maybe her lack of social manners was why men didn't seem at all interested in her. Oh, who was she kidding? It could be her manners. Maybe she didn't know how to dress her hair like a lady, or it could be because she dressed like a man. She didn't know enough about men to know what put them off her. Except for that one man she had truly believed had started to care about her. She was well aware why that man had not pursued his interest in her. He had believed that because of her occupation, and the fact she didn't dress as a lady, she had loose morals. George's mouth quirked as she recalled how she had twisted out of that man's grasp and had him flat on his back in 10 seconds flat. Then she had threatened to shoot him if he ever laid his filthy hands on her again. He never had, and neither had anyone else. Until that afternoon when Eli had comforted her near the creek. With an eye on Grace, George stretched out her legs and mimicked how the other woman held her utensils. How hard could it be to be a lady? "We've been thinking," Josh said then, which was unusual. Although he was the older brother, he usually agreed with whatever his more enthusiastic younger brother said. "We like it here. The railroad is coming west. It seems now might be a good time to claim land while there's still some left." Noah chimed in. "There's an excellent water source, plenty of timber, and the soil seems fertile." "You intend to farm the land?" Eli asked. "It's as good as occupation as any," Josh said. "We'll get settled, build ourselves proper houses, and then we can send for one of those mail-order brides we've read about." Noah grinned. "You'd do that?" George wrinkled her nose. "I can't imagine marrying a man I had never met." "I suppose if they get here and they don't like you, or you don't like them, you can break your bargain." Noah shot a worried look at his brother. "What if they send us women who, we would not want to make a match with?" "I believe you would be right," Josh nodded. "No party is under an obligation to follow through with the bargain." George grinned at Noah, whose enthusiasm was way ahead of his thought processes. She couldn't imagine any lady coming west and not being completely engaged by Noah. Both he and Josh were tall, with broad shoulders and fair hair, and from what she had seen, seemed even-tempered men with no vices. She finished her meal and put her plate down on the grass next to her. Eli was looking at her in a way she couldn't decipher. Even if she could master acting like a lady, she could never figure out men. They were a breed all of their own. "How do you claim land?" she asked. "Far as we know, we measure out our 160 acres. And then we need to file our claim with the land office," Noah added. "Then the fun bit starts. We improve our land for 5 years, and we can finally file for the deed." "You know," Josh said in his quiet way, looking at George, "women can file claims too." George felt warmth spread throughout her body. "I can file a claim." "I believe you must be over 21, Eli added. George nodded. "I need to check with Harry. He isn't very good with birthdays and things like that, but I'm pretty sure I'm of age." "Then you can get land and farm with us." Noah practically bounced where he was sitting. "You in, Eli?" Josh looked towards Eli and Grace, who had stayed quiet, but watched their conversation with interest. Eli's eyes met George's, and she held her breath while waiting for his answer. It shouldn't matter to her whether he wanted to stay, but it did. While staying in one place fulfilled her hopes and dreams, it would mean so much more if Eli and Grace were there with her too. He shook his head, and George felt her heart hit the pit of her stomach. I have a job in Santa Fe and personal family business to take care of there. That was the first she had heard of that. George wondered if it was something to do with the elusive Isaac, or whether it concerned his deceased father. I guess you'll be moving along when Harry is fixed up, Mrs. Mitchell. And the next wagon train comes along, Noah asked. That's certainly been our plan, Grace looked worried. But this is a beautiful spot. I can't imagine Santa Fe has anything better. There's something very calming about country like this, George said. I never have been keen on big, dirty towns. Guess I thought you liked 'em, Noah said. George thought for a moment. The traveling is both the best and worst part of the work I do. I hate always moving from one place to another. Yet, along the trail, I've been able to see the most amazing things. I never would have been able to see them without traveling so much. But you want to settle now, dear? Grace asked. Very much, George nodded. Count me in. I would like to be in on this deal, too. Mama! Eli couldn't have sounded more shocked than if his mother had declared an intention to lift her hem and start dancing around the campfire. I have some money of my own, Grace said. It will be months before Harry's well enough to travel again, won't it? Who knows what can happen in that time? Eli shook his head. I won't stay and learn to be a farmer. Darling, Grace reached over and placed a hand over her son's. I didn't ask you to. I would be happy to cook for these boys, and in return, perhaps they could build a little house for me. Sure thing, Mrs. Mitchell, Noah shot out. I thought you wanted to stay with me, Eli said, incredulity lining his words. So you could be surrounded by a passel of grandchildren. That's what you've always said. Do you have children I don't know about? Grace asked her son gently. No, but... Well then, Grace replied, I think that until you do, I'd rather like to stay here. Maybe if his mother stayed in the little valley they had been stranded in, Eli would eventually decide to stay too. George didn't know about that. Neither could she work out why it bothered her so much that he intended to leave. Chapter 4. A small cabin is the top priority, Josh insisted. If we don't fashion a coop for the chickens, we'll lose every one of them, Noah argued back. And a coop won't take long to make once we gather the necessary supplies. What can I do to help? Eli asked. He could feel George's eyes on him, and when he looked over to where she sat next to the fire, her gaze bore into him with an intensity that had only increased since the previous evening. He had felt, as much as seen, George's disappointment when he had reiterated his desire to move away from their camp when Harry was well enough. The chickens stopped laying when we were traveling, Noah explained. If we get them settled in a coop rather than where they are now, I think they'll start up again. Whereas I think we need a proper shelter for Harry, Josh added. You said he needs to keep the wound clean. Surely that will be easier to ensure if we have a cabin. I guess you're both right, Eli said thoughtfully. What can I do? If you men can cut the trees for both structures and bring the wood to our campsite, I can get started on the coop. George pulled a face. I know I'm just a girl, but I think you all forget I was raised doing everything a man can. I'm sorry, Miss George, Noah blurted. No offense. Eli damped down a feeling of irritation at Noah's quick words, which was only heightened by the smile George sent his way. He forced the muscles in his face to relax and to stop frowning. It was of no concern to him that Noah wanted to ensure he stayed in George's favor. Speaking of which, how is our patient doing this morning? Josh asked. Ever practical and self-possessed. Ornery, George answered before Eli could speak. Eli laughed. He's pleased he still has his leg, but furious I won't let him get up and move about with a crutch. And fit to be tied that we forced him to share a tent with the ladies. George looked over at the tent she had shared the previous evening with Grace and her father. He really should have shared with us, Eli said. No more room in there for another body. Noah grinned and pointed at Eli. And by the way, you snore. Eli saw George smothering a smile in his peripheral vision and couldn't help a childish response. And your feet smell. Noah and Josh howled with laughter, and a moment later, everyone else joined in. Grace wiped her eyes. I can scarcely believe I'm sitting here laughing about a gentleman's feet. Eli sobered. Not quite what we had in mind when we left Boston, is it, Mama? I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, his mother replied. Noah is right. This is a grand adventure, and other than Harry being injured, I am quite enjoying the new experiences. Glad you're enjoying yourselves, Harry shouted from the tent. Is there anything else to eat? You've only just eaten breakfast, Pa, George called back. Turns out breaking a leg is hungry work. Now bring me some more of those biscuits back here before I waste away. We should all get to work, Josh said. We have a lot to do. Shelter, coop, fencing to keep the oxen. Noah held up a hand, raising fingers to make each task. A house for the ladies, and then I think we should head to Topeka to file the claims. Claims? Houses? What is this talk? Harry called. I'll go speak to my father and fill him in on the latest developments, George said with a smile, and take him his second helping of breakfast. I believe I've finished your new gown, Grace announced. We should try it on while your father eats. All in good time, Mama, Eli said. Miss George's clothes were ruined yesterday, and she doesn't have any others. I'll hitch up our wagon, Josh stood. We can load the chopped wood onto that. You best be thinking about where you want your houses built, ladies, Noah called. As the three men walked towards the oxen to hitch up a team to pull the wagon, Eli looked back towards his mother. It felt wrong to leave her alone with only George and an injured man to protect her. Eli, you comin'? Noah called. Do you think the ladies will be okay? We will be gone some time, won't we? Noah chucked. I wouldn't want to be staring down the barrel of George's gun. I'm betting one thing her pa taught her is how to be an excellent shot. That didn't make Eli feel any better. In fact, he was now more concerned than he had been before. Simply the thought of someone approaching his mother and George made his gut churn. George is a pretty unique woman, Eli said. She's great, Noah agreed. Eli's stomach twisted. Indeed. We're so lucky to have met up with you, Noah said in his usual enthusiastic way. I feel as though we've got another brother and a new sister. Sister? Eli repeated. Noah nodded, then frowned. Is something wrong? Eli shook his head. Whatever was he doing? He had no right to question Noah about his intentions towards George. If Noah said he saw George as a sister, it wasn't his right to question that. Neither was it any of his business, though personally he definitely didn't see George as the sister he had never had. To him, she was a wildly beautiful young woman with a gentle heart and spirit, despite her prickly exterior. Of course not, Eli injected a little of Noah's zeal into his voice. Let's go chop some trees. Noah gave him a funny look, shrugged, and followed his brother towards the wagon. George's heart pattered in her chest as she noticed the three men returning from chopping wood. Grace had helped her into her new dress. It was everything that the older woman had promised. For anyone that looked at her, they would see only a beautiful feminine gown. The only people that knew that underneath the skirt, Grace had sewn in trousers, which would allow George the comfort she desired while she worked. Her new friend had not stopped there. Her hair had been taken out of its usual braids and arranged in an intricate style on top of her head. George fought feelings of self-consciousness. You look very beautiful, Grace told her. Now stop fidgeting. Miss George, Noah exclaimed as he caught sight of her. Can that really be you? You look like a real lady, Josh told her. I feel like I should ask you to dance. It seems to me as though you're about to enter a high society ballroom. George laughed. Thank you both very much. I think you're exaggerating my elegance, but I appreciate your sentiments just the same. She looked to Eli, who had arrived with the Prescott brothers. George willed him to say something. Anything was better than the horrible silence that had fallen. Doesn't she look beautiful, darling? Grace said, looking at her son. Yes, she does, Eli whispered. So quietly, George had to strain her ears to hear his response. Lunch is ready, Grace told them, her voice bright. You boys need to wash up before I serve. Josh and Noah headed towards the small bowl Grace had already filled with warm water and began lathering their hands. Eli, however, headed away from camp and towards the creek. George struggled to contain the anger bubbling in her chest. As much as she tried to tell herself that wearing a proper dress and having her hair styled was for herself, deep down she had hoped that Eli would see her as a woman. She grabbed an empty container and marched after him. "I will fetch more water." George was too enraged to care that everyone knew Noah had brought up plenty of water earlier that day. She hated that she was so obviously following Eli, but her ire had overtaken her common sense. "Why are you down here washing when there is water at the camp?" she demanded angrily. Eli shrugged, his back to her. "I prefer to wash down here." "That is absolute hogwash," George said, feeling the fury building inside her once more. "Eli, will you please turn around while I'm speaking to you?" He turned then, his expression guarded. "What do you want from me, George?" Emotion clogged George's throat, and she struggled to force her words free. "Why was it so hard for you to compliment your mother's work?" "Compliment my mother's work, or compliment you, George?" Eli said quietly. "Either." George shrugged as though it didn't matter either way to her, even as the sheen of moisture in her eyes would surely give away her distress. Eli closed his eyes. "It's difficult, George." "Is it so very hard to look at me?" "Yes," Eli whispered. "It's impossible to look at you when you look so very beautiful." "You think I look beautiful?" Eli smiled. "Did I not just say that?" "Yes, you did," George said. "I would very much like to hear you say it again. This time, while you look at me." Eli opened his eyes. "Miss George, you look beautiful." George took a step towards him. "Your mother is very talented." Eli moved towards her. "Yes, she is. But she has not made the color bloom in your cheeks. Neither has she made your hair shine like a raven's wing. She has simply enhanced what was already there. No one has ever said such sweet words to me before. I would have thought there would be men on every trip you have taken in the past who would recognize your beauty." "There have been a few," George admitted. "However, they all seem to think that me wearing trousers meant my character is very different to what it is." "What do you mean?" "My experience with men on the wagon train suggests they believe my morals are very low." George blushed as she spoke. "And you think their behavior is because of the way you dress?" "What other reason could it be?" "Perhaps it is simply the job you are doing. I do not believe that your appearance or your demeanor would lead men to believe you are anything but a very virtuous young woman." George thought for a moment. She had never considered that the way she had lived her life would encourage false assumptions about her, though she had never really picked her vocation. More like it had always just been something that she had done. As the years passed and she got older, she had naturally taken on more responsibility, and working alongside her father had just been something that she did. "I soon put them in their place." Eli grinned at her. "I'm almost afraid to ask what you did." "I twisted one man's arm behind his back, tripped him up, and then while he was laying flat on his back, I aimed my rifle straight at his heart." Eli chuckled. "What happened then?" "Not a lot. He never touched me again, though." "It makes me furious to imagine men trying to take advantage of you," Eli said grimly. George swallowed. "Why?" Eli closed the gap between them. "You are too special." George again blinked away the moisture that formed in her eyes. No one had ever called her beautiful or special before in her life. "Eli." Eli didn't say a thing. He simply closed the space between them and cupped her face in his hands. He stared into her eyes for a long moment before bending his head to gently press his lips against hers. New sensations flooded through George. So this was what it was like to be truly desired by a man, and not simply being used for his own pleasure, as had happened to her previously. This was everything she had ever dreamed of. Chapter 5. Some days later, and with Grace's house finished, Josh and Noah reiterated their plan to travel to Topeka and stake their claims. Eli could feel George's eyes on him, and for the first time since their kiss, he wholeheartedly regretted his actions. They hadn't been at all gentlemanly, and despite his anger that other men had tried to take advantage of her, hadn't he done exactly the same thing? Hadn't he taken what he wanted with no intention of offering anything in return? He swallowed past the painful lump taking up residence in his throat. How long will it take? We believe around a week to get there, conduct our business, and return, Josh said. Is there anything anyone needs? A miracle, Harry called from the other side of the fire. What would you do with a miracle? George asked. I'd have my leg fixed up good and proper so I can help around the place, instead of sitting in one place like an invalid. You should be grateful I've let you out of bed, Eli said mildly. Most doctors would have kept you in bed longer. The wound has healed, Harry grumbled. Your tibia, however, has not. You can't see inside my leg, Harry went on. Eli sighed. Are you doubting my doctoring? No, sir, Harry replied, running the two words together. I will be forever grateful to you that I have a leg and not a stump. It's just frustrating for me to be idle. Grace gathered up the finished breakfast plates and dumped them in the bowl of warm, soapy water Eli had carried outside earlier. No reason one of the boys can't move that water nearer to you. Those dishes won't wash themselves. Harry's mouth hung open. Oh, Mrs. Mitchell, ma'am, you can't mean that I should do women's work. Josh and Noah laughed out loud at Harry's extreme reaction to Grace's suggestion. It's only a few dishes, and it'll stop you being idle. George looked at her father reproachfully. It would also be a very good way of paying these kind folk back for the help that they have freely offered to you. When you put it like that, I suppose I could bring myself to help in that way. Harry's gaze slid over to his daughters, to Eli, then back again. What will you be doing while I'm washing dishes and the boys are in Topeka? George flushed just as Eli realized Harry was aware something was going on between himself and George. The old man clearly missed nothing. The usual, Pa, George said in a voice that sounded a little unsure to Eli's ears. Helping Grace, taking care of you, then seeing if Eli needs any help to make the fence to keep in the oxen. We keep in those beasts, Harry wondered. We could probably kill them for their meat. Eli wrinkled his nose. Do people eat oxen? People eat cows, Noah put in. Harry added. Seems a waste of an animal for it to be eating grass but not producing anything. That's a good point, Josh nodded. The oxen don't cost us anything to keep as they feed on the grass, but they are of no practical use. What would you suggest? Eli asked. I'd trade 4 oxen for a cow, Noah suggested. More if we can make a good bargain. Then we will have fresh milk. Josh nodded. That is a good plan. Do we all agree? Eli felt funny about adding his assent to Noah's idea, but they had all agreed in the early days of their little camp community that each person should state their agreement to a proposal before they carried it out. He didn't intend to stay, and they all knew that. Yet they still gave him equal say. It didn't seem right. Do we need any provisions from the general store in Council Grove? Noah asked. We're going to look mighty silly traveling all the way to Topeka with 4 oxen and an empty wagon. Can't you change the wagon? George wondered. I've seen it done before where the length is shortened and then only 2 oxen are needed to pull the wagon. You could then take 4 to trade. Miss George, Noah announced. You are a genius. I could kiss you. Eli felt the familiar twisting of his stomach each time Noah said something even slightly personal to George. His hands curled into fists, and he wanted nothing more than to tell Noah to back off. The only person who was kissing George was him. Only he couldn't tell the other man that, not when he would not stay around and claim George for his own. In a sisterly way, of course, Noah muttered low enough that only Eli could hear. It took a moment for Eli to grasp the other man's meaning. Eli glanced over at Noah, who was staring pointedly at Eli's hands. He took a deep breath and forced every muscle from his toes to the ones controlling his frown to relax. This quickness to anger and overprotectiveness towards George had to end. He had to find some way to make it stop. It's a wonderful idea, Josh said into the sudden silence. Eli could feel all eyes on him. Yes, it is. And I'm sure the wood we cut off the wagon would go to good use. The others nodded, but the atmosphere had gone flat. Eli felt terrible that his reaction to Noah's words had been so obvious to everyone. He needed to put this situation straight. I don't believe we need further provisions, Grace broke the lingering quiet. We all bought enough to last us many weeks. so there's plenty left. Good, Josh said. So we all agree. We'll use 2 oxen to pull the wagon and tie 4 to the back. We will trade those oxen for as many cows as we can get. Everyone nodded. Only thing that remains is for you boys to count how many stakes you're claiming at the land office, Harry said, his voice low and his gaze firmly on Eli. 1 for each of us, Josh began. 1 for Mrs. Mitchell and 1 for Miss George. Harry nodded. Agreed. I will move on as soon as I can. Eli watched as father and daughter looked at each other, silent words passing between them. Eli, his mother asked, I will move on too. Pain flashed across George's face, and Eli closed his eyes, not wanting to see proof of the damage his own actions had caused. Why had he given in to the overwhelming impulse to kiss George? He needed to be stronger and more focused on his quest to reach Santa Fe, take up his new position, and find the men who had helped bring about his father's downfall. Later that day, George made her way over to the section of land they had allowed their oxen to graze. Noah had plans to raise horses one day, but they were a long way from achieving that lofty aim. Horses were expensive to keep, and while they had nothing to sell, they were not in a position to buy anything, let alone a horse. Josh and Noah had left for Topeka. Her father and Grace were debating the merits of a meal that comprised of yet another rabbit that Noah had caught and fried beans. Grace had suggested the meal wasn't complete without vegetables, while Harry was regaling Grace with tall stories of things he had eaten over the years. For someone who had not made a single thing with his hands in his entire life, Eli had worked alongside Josh and Noah without complaint. She had seen blisters form on his palms and heard the choked-off gasps that told her his shoulders were aching. He was sure working a lot for someone who was not planning on sticking around to enjoy the fruit of his labors. He had only that morning reiterated his desire to leave the valley. His admission had hurt George. She had heard it before. She should have been expecting it. Yet she had allowed the moment they had shared by the creek to persuade her that perhaps he had changed his mind and he meant to stay. However embarrassing it would be for her, she meant to find out how she could have read his feelings so wrongly. She may well be naive in romantic relationships, but she believed that he had started to care for her. George watched as Eli swung the axe, a frown of concentration on his face. He turned, as though sensing her presence, and put the axe down. What is it, George? She had already made plain her intention to help him that day. He surely had been expecting her to do just that. However, his face registered something that was somewhere between displeasure and resignation. I would like to speak to you, she said, as bravely as she could. Eli nodded. I guess I knew you would. He laid down the axe and suggested they walk to the creek. George did not want to go to the spot where he had kissed her. The shady part of land where a small grove of sugar maple trees grew near the banks of the creek was a lovely spot. She didn't want that tainted in her mind by their conversation. She had no illusions that their talk was going to end well. George reached up to grab hold of her braid before remembering she no longer wore her hair that way. Although it took her longer to get ready in a morning, she had kept up the style Grace had shown her. She now had 2 dresses that Grace had altered for her, and those 2 things, however small, helped to make her feel more confident in herself. She sat beneath the tree in the shade and busied her hands by plucking at the grass. Mighty hot out, Eli said, wiping his brow on the bandana sticking out of his back pocket. It's nearly June, she replied awkwardly. It gets extremely hot in these parts during the summer. I'll be glad of the shade as the days go by. It was another reminder that she would use the trees to escape the heat of the day, but Eli would not. George watched as he dipped the red cloth into the stream and wiped it across the back of his neck and over his face. What did you want to ask me, George? He asked tiredly. Tell me why you are so set on going to Santa Fe, she asked, trying not to sound as though she was desperately begging for the truth. Tell me why you won't stay here, with me. George looked away as she said the last words, unwilling to watch his emotions flick across his expressive face. He was such an honest man. Everything he felt was clear to see. She had used all her boldness up on her words. You know why, he told her softly. She turned her face to his once more. Eli, I don't. You've said because of your job and some other business, but you haven't said. I came to believe that perhaps you had feelings for me. I think I deserve the truth. Eli expelled his breath on a long sigh. You're right, I should have told you about Amelia at the beginning. George felt her heart crack wide open. Amelia? My fiancée. But, George whispered, shock and confusion coursing through her veins. Eli, how could you have not mentioned a fiancée? How could your mother have not told me about her? She refused to come west with me, so we broke off our arrangement. George dragged air into her lungs. Amelia was in the past. That thought was quickly chased through her brain by another. Was Eli still in love with this woman? She couldn't force herself to ask that question. I'm already west, George forced the words past numb lips. Oh, George, I know that. Somehow, the fact he was calling her simply George, and not Miss George, upset her. It had been an annoying nickname when he first began calling her that. Now she treasured that small endearment, and longed to see the teasing smile that had once accompanied those words from his lips. I'm very fond of you, he went on. You must know that. A spark of anger shot through her. I would hope so. I wouldn't like to think you kiss girls you have no feelings for. Eli raked a hand through his hair. I should never have done that. George closed her eyes and wished she could put her hands over her ears so she didn't have to hear any more. I'm glad you did. It was the most exciting moment of my life. Eli groaned. George, I'm so very sorry. If things were different. If you weren't still in love with Amelia, George said, unable to keep the bitterness from creeping into her voice. I'm sorry, he repeated. Then he turned and walked away from her. George had thought nothing could hurt like the longing she had experienced all her life, to be like the other women she saw every day. She was wrong. Despite her very best efforts to the type of woman that would be attractive to a man, she had been turned down. It was better when she hadn't tried. At least then she did not have hope. Now her confidence lay shattered at her feet, and she realized what she had always believed was true. She was just not good enough. Chapter 6. George eventually washed her face in the creek and made her way back to the camp. She should help Eli with the fence, but she couldn't bear to be near him without feeling horribly deceived. There you are. Grace greeted her with her usual sweet smile. Your father has been telling me the most terrible tales about things he's eaten when hungry. He says he once ate a snake. George forced a smile. Oh, that story is true. He roasted it over the fire. I watched him with my own eyes. Grace made a face of disgust before her face creased into a worried frown. Are you all right, dear? George nodded. I need to speak to my pa. He's gone back into the cabin. Said something about it being hotter than Hades, and the summer would kill anything we tried to grow or rear in the valley. That sounds like Pa, she said with a chuckle. Forever the optimist. She walked over to the cabin and knocked gently on the door before cracking it open. Pa, George whispered, are you awake? I am now, Harry replied. George smiled. Her father's behavior was nothing if not predictable. He had successfully curated a reputation for being a miserable old man, but she was one of the few who could see his soft heart. Come sit here, my girl. Harry patted the edge of the cot. George walked around to the right-hand side that he indicated and sat next to her father. Oh, Pa. He reached out a hand and patted her cheek. Tell your old Pa all about it. He kissed me, the words burst free from George's mouth. But he doesn't want me. I'm not good enough for him. Now, see here, Harry adjusted his position in his cot, as though he intended to use the gnarled tree branch he used as a crutch to wrap around Eli's head. What is that hoity-toity Eastern fool playing at? Calm down, Pa. George rested a hand on her father's chest. You can't come in here telling me that fella has taken liberties and expect me to remain calm. He kissed me last week, George clarified. Today it became apparent I am not good enough for him. Harry lifted a hand. Wait, he hasn't told you you're not good enough for him. Has he said he does not want you in words? Not in words, Pa, George admitted. but he is still in love with his fiancée. What? Harry howled. Ex-fiancée, George added quickly. She wouldn't come out west with him, so they called off their engagement. And he thought he'd kiss the first girl he saw to make himself feel better. George looked toward the open door and wished she had kept her heartache to herself. Even her own father thought Eli had no feelings for her. Now, George, my girl, I didn't mean that quite as it came out. Didn't you? She asked resentfully. Seems you about summed it up. You look mighty pretty all done up, Harry said. Any man should be proud to have you on his arm. Eli is a fool. You're my father. George's mouth twisted into a smile, despite herself. You have to say that. Harry nodded. True, but I mean it. You were always a cute little thing, but that sophisticated hair and ladylike dress have definitely smartened you right up. The Prince of Wales himself would surely have his head turned. Pa, George said in mock scandal. The Prince of Wales is a married man. Ah, well, I don't keep up with such things. Harry shook his head. Anyway, about Eli. Should I get out my shotgun? George laughed softly. I don't think there's any need for that. Besides, Herb drove off with everything we owned, remember? Including your rifle. Well, if you change your mind, you can always sneak into the Prescott boys' tent and borrow theirs. We're not threatening Eli with a gun. Who said anything about threats? Harry grumbled. If he's broken my little girl's heart, he deserves to stare down the barrel of a gun held in my hands. It was just a kiss. Harry observed his daughter's face and slowly shook his head. Not to you it wasn't. George paused and gathered together her courage. I think I love him, Pa. Whatever am I to do? Do you think it would help if you told him? Maybe he would change his mind about this other gal? I couldn't, George shook her head decisively. He said clearly if things were different. You don't think you can persuade him? I don't want to persuade him, Pa, George said miserably. I want him to choose me for myself, and not because I am a poor replacement for Amelia. The man is a fool not to see what is right before him. I think you've said that, Pa. George smiled despite her sorrow. About 3 times now. Truth can't be said enough. Doesn't change anything. George's chin dropped to her chest. I'm just not good enough for him. I think you have that the wrong way around. Harry stroked the top of George's head. If he can't see what an absolute gem he would have in you, then he does not deserve you. George laid her head on her father's shoulder and drank in the familiar scent of him. As comforting as Harry was, he was not the man whose arms she wanted around her. Elijah, his mother's voice demanded immediate attention. It had been many years since his name sounded as though it had been torn from her lips in disappointment. Mama, he replied, wishing he could miss another meal and avoid the interrogation that was clearly coming his way. You're eating with us this evening? She asked coolly. I wanted to finish the section of the fence I was working on, Eli responded in self-defense, though it was pointless. He hadn't wanted to return to the campfire because he hadn't wanted to face anyone, most of all George, who didn't deserve his poor treatment of her. What have you done to Georgianna? Grace hissed. I didn't. Eli wanted to explain that it hadn't been his intention to hurt George, but that wouldn't be acceptable to his mother. The fact remained, he had. I like her, Mama. I really like her. I am not interested in flowery words, Grace snapped. And by the look of that poor girl, she isn't either. What did you do? There was no avoiding the inevitable. I kissed her. Eli sighed, but did not look away from his mother while he waited for her response. Grace took a moment to stir the pot over the campfire before answering. And then, because kisses rarely lead to young ladies sobbing their hearts out, Eli grimaced. He would do anything to take back the action that led to George's distress. I think, because of that, she hoped I would stay. And you can't? You know why I can't, Mama. No, Eli, I do not. Grace pointed the ladle at her son. I do not understand why you were so fired up to go to Santa Fe. I can't believe you, of all people, would ask me that. Eli shook his head. I am doing it for you. You deserve. Stop. His mother's voice was harsh in the still afternoon air. Do not pretend you are doing it for me. Eli frowned in confusion. It was all for his mother. She should not have been forced to leave her house, her possessions, her entire life because of his father's sins. If there was a chance of putting it right, then he would. I want you to have... You want, Grace interrupted him again. Can you hear yourself? You haven't asked me what I want. You have just assumed. Why haven't you considered my choices recently? I am happy to stay here. The boys are staking my claim right now. I am going to own land here. Why would I want what you think I do? You can't possibly mean to stay here. Eli shook his head. Especially if I can restore father's wealth to our family. Oh, Eli, his mother sounded desperately sad. Have you never considered that your father was dishonest in his last letter to us? Eli shook his head. Never. Why would you ask that? Is that what you believe? Grace nodded. I am certain your father lied. He has been a gambler for years. That last letter was his final gamble. But they left town. Eli looked into his mother's face, trying to work out what she was thinking and where she had got her steadfast belief from. They must have cheated Papa. Why would they have left if they were innocent? That was one game. Grace bent her head, and to Eli's horror, he watched as silent tears poured down his mother's face. Every time he lost, we had to sell something else. The last time, we simply couldn't sell enough to keep our home. It doesn't matter if he was cheated that last time. Not when you consider all the times before. Eli sat down heavily and put an arm around his mother. Why didn't you tell me any of this before? Would it have changed anything? You still would have wanted to come west to get out of Boston. That was true. His own shame at his father's actions had led to him wiring his old friend in Santa Fe and eventually being offered a job. However, he had convinced himself that his mother couldn't possibly live with the pain of his father's last humiliating act. And Amelia? She was never the girl for you, Grace smiled through her tears. She was your father's choice and intended for Isaac. Eli hated the crack in his mother's voice every time she talked about her eldest son. There was simply no excuse for his decision to absent himself from his family. Eli had long since given up believing his brother would ever be reunited with his family. Grace wholeheartedly believed her eldest child was alive. I was devastated when she refused to bring forward our wedding and travel with us. You were not, Grace disagreed staunchly. Your pride was hurt, not your feelings. Son, Grace said gently, stop lying to yourself. How you feel right now, this very minute. Does that compare to how you felt when Amelia refused you? Eli considered how hurt he had been. Amelia would not agree to marry him earlier than planned. His mother was right. That did not compare to the pain he'd had in his chest since speaking to George earlier that day. He could not bear knowing he caused her distress. Mama, what shall I do? Pray, Grace said decisively. Pray, and God will surely give you a respite from your pain and an answer to your question. My question? Of course the question is, should you go on to Santa Fe and continue a fool's errand or stay here and build a future? I'm a doctor, not a farmer. Eli's head swam with the swirling emotions and the alternative picture of truth that his mother had painted for him. You are, Grace agreed. But my feeling is that those boys intend to make this little settlement of ours into a thriving western town. And if the railroad passes somewhere nearby, you'll have more patience than you'll know what to do with. Eli reached over and kissed his mother's cheek before getting up from the ground. I need to think. What about your meal? She called after him. Please save me some. I will eat later. He didn't know how long it was going to take him to work through the issues they had spoken about. All Eli did know was that it was going to take a lot of praying before he could make his world feel stable again. The one thing he had set out on this journey to do, to restore his mother's position in society, she did not want. Worse, his actions had caused her to be disappointed in him, and that was harder to bear than facing up to his father's iniquities. Chapter 7. A week later, a storm of dust off in the distance gradually became the shape of a wagon and the return of Josh and Noah. They had barely come to a complete stop before Noah jumped down from the wagon and thrust a wriggling bundle into George's arms. "What on earth?" Grace looked over George's shoulder. "A puppy?" "Figured we could do with a guard dog." Noah grinned. "Another mouth for me to feed," Grace said in mock anger. "Eli is always going on about how he doesn't want to be away from the cabin for too long, because it's leaving you ladies alone with an invalid." "Come here and call me that, Sonny," Harry yelled. "The dog will bark if there's anyone about or any wildlife that could cause us harm. It's an excellent addition to our settlement." Josh rubbed the top of the dog's head. "The little guy just needs a name." Grace looked behind the wagon. "You have 2 cows." "We were lucky," Noah told them. "A family was going over to Oregon and needed oxen. Seems the ones they were sold in Independence were not fit for the journey. They were happy to exchange." "I don't think they were happy," Josh added. "In fact, the wife was mighty angry." "Do you boys know what to do with a cow?" George wondered. "Certainly do, Miss George," Noah said. "I'd be pleased to show you in the morning. We're going to need to build a barn." "What is that you have back there?" Grace pointed at an item covered by a blanket. "A rooster," Noah said proudly. "Then we can have baby chicks. Expand our brood. Some for the pot and some for laying eggs." "Don't those infernal things screech at dawn?" Harry asked. "Sure do," Noah grinned. "It'll make sure we're all up working and not sleeping the day away." George laughed as the puppy licked her chin. "He's very sweet, Noah. Thought you might want something to keep you company." Noah took off his hat and banged it against his legs to shake some of the dust off of it. "You know, when Eli moves on." Had she made her feelings so obvious to everyone in their little camp? George supposed she must have, because everyone seemed to be fully aware. If only she looked more like East Coast Amelia, she might not be feeling as bereft as she was. Noah was right. The puppy would be a good distraction. "That is very thoughtful, Noah. Thank you." He shrugged. "It's nothing. Family should look after each other, and that is how I think of you all." "Eli, you've been very busy," Josh said as he returned. George had been so busy with the puppy she hadn't noticed the quieter brother leave the camp area until he returned. "Yeah, I wanted to get the fence up and a good amount of wood ready so we can start building Mama's house. Did everything go smoothly with the claims?" "It did," Josh confirmed. "We were asked if we were giving a name to our settlement, but we hadn't talked about that when we left. Apparently, we can add that information on if wish." "You're a landowner, Mama," Eli announced. Grace nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. "I need to decide exactly where on my land I would like you boys to build my house, don't I?" "Yes, ma'am." Noah whacked his hat against his legs one last time before jamming it back on his head. "I think I'll take the puppy to the creek and see if he's thirsty," George said. As excited as she was to know she now owned a piece of this land that she had come to love, it meant she was putting down roots while Eli was still struggling to find a place to plant his. She couldn't help but feel a little sad about that. She put the animal down at the edge of the stream and watched as he leaned forward and lapped at the water with his little pink tongue. He then bounded back to her, jumped into her lap, and covered her face with cold doggy kisses. "He likes you," Noah nodded. "I knew he would." "I'm very grateful." Noah shuffled his feet, as he was apt to do when nervous. "I hope it isn't out of place for me say, Miss George, but if Eli has hurt your feelings or done something to upset you, I'm more than happy to bop him on the nose for you." George spluttered out a laugh. "I won't need you to do that for me, but thank you. My pa has already offered to shoot him. I'm grateful I have 2 such wonderful men looking out for my honor." "There's a preacher in Council Grove," Noah went on. "Won't take but 2 minutes to go get him. Harry can borrow my gun, and you could be wed fast as you like." "Noah." George smiled. He really was the sweetest man. "As much as I would love to be Eli's wife, I only want that if he wants it too. And you know it takes a lot longer than 2 minutes to travel to Council Grove." "A day and a half," Noah admitted. "But you say the word, and I'll be glad to fetch him." "I know you would," George said. "I think I'd rather wait until I'm asked to be a wife before I get married." "Fair enough," Noah nodded. "I'll be getting back to camp now, but if you change your mind." George smiled her thanks and turned back to the warm bundle in her lap. She scratched behind the puppy's ears, and he looked up at her with such an adoring gaze, it almost brought tears back to her eyes. Even though she was certain she had cried enough to refill the creek in front of her, she still seemed to be moments away from another weeping session. George believed that if it was as easy to make Eli love her as it was for the little dog, she would never stop smiling for the rest of her life. That evening, Grace prayed over their food before serving the gathered group. She thanked God for bringing Josh and Noah safely home and for guiding them to choose such wonderful additions to their camp. It was impossible not to join in the excitement that Noah brought back with him, and Eli listened to the other man's plans for their land. "I'm mighty glad to see you looking better, Mr. Walton," Josh remarked. "You still planning on moving out when your friend comes back this way? Or have my brother's plans encouraged you to stay on?" "Don't have nothing else I can do," he said. "All my working life I've bought and sold things and traveled. Ain't nothing else I can do. With all this time to think, it's clear I should have done something different for my little girl." "No, Pa." George shook her head. "You did the right thing for me." "Traveling trails after me weren't no proper life for a little girl," he disagreed. "It hasn't done me any harm." "No? Well," Harry shrugged, "I don't go in for all that mushy stuff. But lots of people offered to take you off my hands when you were small. Wouldn't let 'em. You were a part of your mother, and I treasured you then as I treasure you now." George leaned her head against her father's shoulder. "Pa, that was beautiful." "You'd best not be weeping on my good shirt," he said gruffly. Eli watched the interchange between father and daughter with a smile. It was impossible not to be around Harry for long without being entertained. The man was one of a kind. George sat close to her father, her new puppy sleeping snuggled up on her feet. It was a pretty picture that he would store in his mind to recall when he felt lonely in the months to come. It surely couldn't be too much longer until a wagon train passed by that he could join. "Mrs. Mitchell," Noah said, "I hope you don't mind if I read a bit from the Bible tonight." It had become their habit to eat their meal and sit back to listen to a few verses before they cleared away their plates and retired for the night. "Of course I don't mind." Grace reached behind her and passed the thick volume over to Noah. "It would be a pleasure to listen to you." Noah nodded and flicked through the pages, appearing to look for a particular passage. He cleared his throat, looked around at his audience, and then coughed. "Excuse me." Noah took a sip of water. "I would like to read from the book of Proverbs. I came across this passage when I was talking to that preacher back in Council Grove." Eli was a little disconcerted that every time Noah looked up from the book, his gaze locked with Eli's. He cleared his throat again. Proverbs 16, verses 18 to 19. Grace made a strange noise that appeared to be somewhere between a laugh and a hiccup. She waved a hand. "Do carry on, Noah. 'Pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall. Better it is to be of an humble spirit with the lowly, than to divide the spoil with the proud.'" "You choose those words for any reason, boy?" Harry inquired with an arched eyebrow. "No, sir, I just kind of like them." Noah looked both innocent and embarrassed at the same time, though they was fitting. Eli stared at him with suspicion, but Noah simply raised one shoulder in a guileless gesture. It solidified everything that had been running through Eli's mind since his mother had spoken so honestly to him. He had been foolish. His feelings for George were not going to go away, whether he went to Santa Fe or anywhere else on God's earth. Now all he had to do was work out what he was going to do about his decision. "Where are we going?" George laughed nervously as Grace led her away from the camp. "Shouldn't we see who the boys are talking to?" "Don't be so inquisitive, dear," Grace said. "Are you not as keen as I am to find out who our visitor is?" "Obviously not." "Why do I need a blindfold on?" "I told you," Grace's voice was full of glee. "I have something to show you." The atmosphere in camp that day, a couple of days after Noah's Bible reading, had an undercurrent of secrets and mischief. Everyone seemed to be in on it apart from George. She hoped the Prescott boys, well, Noah, really, hadn't encouraged Grace to take part in a ridiculous scheme that would make things worse between Eli and herself. They meant well, but it was hard enough to come to terms with her feelings when she had to see him every day. She didn't want a wagon train to come along and take him away from her for good. Yet that was also her dearest wish. "Are we nearly there?" Nearly. Grace pulled her quickly to one side. That nameless animal nearly tripped the both of us up. You really need to think of something to call him. George nodded. I will. Right, Grace said, sounding a little breathless. We're here. Are you ready? I guess so. George felt the bandana that Grace had insisted she wear being untied from the back of her hair and something being put in its place. She lifted a hand. What is that? Flowers, Grace whispered, then pointed in front of them. Look. All four men stood near the creek, with a stranger who was holding a book. What is going on? Noah shuffled his feet. This here is the preacher I told you about. What is he doing here? George asked, then gasped at the rudeness of her question. Well, Eli stepped forward. He's here because Noah asked him to come, just in case. Just in case what? George was thoroughly confused. In case you agreed to marry me. She laughed out loud. You haven't even asked me, and you're leaving. How could Noah? I could see the way things were heading, Miss George. Noah nodded at the preacher. So I asked him to come by here 3 days after we left Council Grove. And he came on the off chance I could persuade you to become my wife, Eli went on. Is that possible, George? This is too much. She shook her head, feeling unsure of herself, while everyone else seemed absolutely certain this was the best idea they had ever heard of. I think I need to know why you have changed your mind so completely. Last week you were in love with a different woman. The preacher looked at Noah, who raised his hands in the air, palms up. Don't know nothing about another woman. I was never in love with Amelia. Then why were you engaged to her? George was excruciatingly aware that they should have this conversation in private. She was my brother's intended. I sort of stepped in after Isaac had been missing for a few years. The marriage was arranged between her father and mine. But you said... I may have misled you, Eli said. And for that, I am sorry. I told you if things were different, I would be free to pursue my feelings for you. I allowed you to think I was in love with Amelia. I can't marry a man who keeps secrets from me. Eli moved closer, gathered her into his arms, and kissed her temple. What would you like to know, my love? Hey, Harry called. The kissing of the bride comes after the ceremony, not before. George shook her head. This was like an insane dream. Everyone seemed convinced there would be a wedding, but she herself, the intended bride, was the only one who was holding back. Even that morning when she awoke, she would have been certain she would have married Eli under any kind of circumstances. Everything, she said simply. I want to know everything about you, Eli. You know I'm from Boston, Eli began. My father was a gambler. I believe that he was cheated in his last game. It was my goal to find the people who swindled my father out of his money. Who were in Santa Fe, George guessed. Exactly, Eli nodded. I wasn't aware until my mother told me last week that Papa had been a gambler for many years. She did not want to think badly of my father. However, she helped me to see that even if I could regain the money he lost that night, there was no way to replace everything he had lost over the years. That must have hurt you very much. Father had lost so much money that last loss resulted in the bank foreclosing on our house and his business as a doctor. Eli smiled at George. This last part is quite distressing. Are you certain you wish to hear it? Trembling, George nodded. He was piece by piece, taking away all the obstacles that stood in their way. If it concerns you, then yes, I would like to hear it. Father left a letter and then took his own life in his office. I was so ashamed. Wrongly, I believed my mother wanted to be restored to the place she had once occupied in Boston society. She helped me to see that the only one that wanted that was me. I wanted things to be as they had always been. I wanted to undo all the harm my father had done. That is understandable, George murmured. It was, Eli agreed. But it wasn't right. I was doing it for myself, though I told myself it was all for Mama. I didn't give her desires a moment's thought until we were forced to stay here. She helped me to realize that a man's worth is not counted by the coins in his pocket, but by the nature of his actions. Oh, Eli, George breathed. So this means that I eventually... Took you sweet time about it, Harry called out. Indeed, Eli nodded. Eventually, I worked out that I want to live here, with you, or in Boston, with you, or on the top of the tallest mountain, with you. What I'm trying to say, Miss Georgianna Walton, is that I don't care where I live so long as I'm with you. George's heart dipped at the way he said her name. I want to stay here. I'm glad you said that. As he spoke, the four men moved away from the position they had been standing in. Eli led George over. These are the foundations for our home. Our home? Yes, he confirmed. Our home on your land, if you'll have me, as your husband, I mean. George smiled at her completely unflappable Eastern gentleman, getting tongue-tied talking to her. It was unfathomable. She decided she would try to make sense of it later. Right then, she had a wedding to attend. I think you should ask me. I've already sought your pa's blessing. Ask me, she repeated. Eli made a great show of getting down onto one knee in front of her, keeping both of her hands tightly gripped in his own. Miss Georgianna Walton, would you do me the incredible honor of becoming my wife? She nodded. Whoops of delight sounded from the men, and tears prickled behind her eyes. Yes, she replied. 1,000 times, yes. Epilogue. 8 months later, Herb nodded his head. Looks like I was right. Getting stranded here with these fine folks sure worked out well for you, George. What do you mean? George raised a suspicious eyebrow. Time may have passed by, but she was still angry with the man who had professed to be her father's friend. If I didn't find myself in this delicate condition, I would make you pay for the way you abandoned us. Herb cackled. Well, as I said, getting abandoned sure worked out for you. Herb, you old fool, Harry called, limping toward his friend. Leg never did heal? Herb nodded towards Harry's left leg. Still got it, though, Harry said proudly. Got some money for you, Herb said then, taking hold of the money pouch he had tied around his waist. What for? Your share for the goods traded in Santa Fe. Harry shook his head. Didn't even get halfway there, Herb. I can't take a share. Pa, George hissed. Take the money. Sure you can, Herb replied. It's only right. What would I do with money in a place like this? Harry opened his hands wide to encompass the surrounding prairie. George nudged her father none too gently with her hip. Take the money. Seems to be that now you're lame, and probably too old for traveling all the way south. You could open your own trading place right here. Won't be too long until the railroad reaches these parts. Won't be no need for wagon trains then. Harry stared at his friend. When did you get so wise? Herb shrugged and shuffled his feet. You taking this money, you could buy that grandkid of yours a store-bought crib, so the baby is all fancy like his pa. I'd rather have our possessions from the wagon than any store-bought item, George said quietly. Herb moved off to the back of his wagon and came back hefting a wooden chest. All in there, missy. No need to get snippy. George threw open the lid and rummaged around inside, feeling emotion rise in her chest like a spring. I didn't think I'd ever see these things again. Eli moved over to his wife's side and kissed her temple. Am I not always telling you to trust in the Lord? I should probably start listening to you more, George admitted. At last, Eli let out a gusty mock sigh. The woman will finally listen to her husband. Don't get ahead of yourself, George teased. I'll only listen to you about God things. Everything else you say, I'll probably still ignore. Take me back east with you, Herb, Eli laughed. Can you see what I have to put up with? Looks like a mighty fine setup you have here, Herb said wistfully. Have you named your little valley? Walton Valley, George said, nodding as she said the words. Because if it wasn't for my pa, we never would have settled here. Perfect. I'll make us a sign right now, Noah said excitedly. Everything is an adventure to that boy. Harry shook his head. Ain't nothing in this world that isn't exciting to him. Oh, to be young and feel that way again, Herb mused. You ain't never been young, Harry retorted. Now get on with you, old man. Move along out of my valley. Herb slapped Harry on the back and pushed a money pouch into his still reluctant hands. Be seein' ya. George waited until the wagons had all moved on before embracing her father. Now you have something you can do. You can be the proprietor of Walton Valley General Store. Well, I'll be, Harry said, then turned away. Seems like some of that prairie dust has got in my eyes. My wife is part of a family of business owners. Eli pulled George against his side. So is my husband, George replied. We're married, remember. What's mine is also yours. My family is your family. I have never been more blessed. Eli kissed the top of George's head. Not even when you lived back in East and had lots of fine things. Especially not then, Eli replied, because then I did not have you. Wagon Train Wife, Book 1 in this brand new historical Western romance series, will be released in March 2021. Pre-order using the link below if you want to read more about the newest settlers to Walton Valley. Click to order Wagon Train Wife.